Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And as always, that means some smart talk radios in your future. And this segment should be a fascinating discussion indeed. We're going to be talking to Daniel Bolger, a fascinating new work called Our Year of War. Two Brothers, Vietnam and a Nation Divided. That should be an interesting conversation for sure. Daniel Bolger served in the Army for 35 years. He retired as lieutenant colonel, spent some time nearby at Fort Leavenworth. He commanded troops in both Afghanistan and Iraq, earning 5 Bronze Star medals, one for valor in the Combat Action Badge. He is the author of 8 previous works, a contributing editor for Army Magazine, and currently teaches history at North Carolina State in Raleigh, North Carolina. Dan, how are you, my friend?
I'm fine, Warner. How are you?
Well, we're good here and pleased to have you here. Share with our Lewis at Large listeners, if you would, a little bit more about your background and particularly one as a person that served in the military. Why the authorship? Why the interest in writing?
Well, I found, Warner, that reading and writing are fundamental to anybody who is interested in developing themselves as a professional in any field, and that's certainly true in the military. U.S. military has always prized schooling. I mean, many of the folks out there may be aware that the premier Army school at Fort Leavenworth, the Command and General Staff College, has graduated people like George Patton, Dwight Eisenhower, all those famous commanders of the past. And so besides the official schooling, I continued to read and write while I was in the service. And after 35 years of service, I kept reading and writing outside of it. And I think it's a good way to just learn more about what's going on now by learning more about the past.
Well, this story of these two brothers that served in Vietnam, obviously that period, regardless of your opinion of that war and the politics of the time, was certainly a lightning rod for politics at the time, and certainly one that was pretty much divided the country, as the book title implies. Tell us a little bit about the Hagels and how you found out about them.
Well, Chuck and Tom Hagel are two brothers, baby boomers. Chuck born in 1946, Tom born in 1948. And they had 2 younger brothers besides them that came along at 2-year intervals thereafter. They're from Nebraska. They were born in the Sandhills, in the west side of the state, so they're Midwesterners. I had met Chuck Hagel. He's the one that many of the folks may have heard of. He was a U.S. Senator for 2 terms from Nebraska from 97 till 2009. And then he was the U.S. Secretary of Defense from 2013 to 2015. So I had met him during my time in service. And one of the things he said stuck with me. He'd mentioned in passing that he had served in the Army as an enlisted soldier, rose to rank of sergeant in the infantry, ground combat in Vietnam, and that his brother had served with him in the same platoon and was also a sergeant. And so when I was looking to write something as we came up on the 50th anniversary of 1968 and the Great Tet Offensive, I remembered back to the Hagel brothers. And when I started checking them out even a little, I found out, hey, they served there in 68. They were both in the Tet Offensive, as participants. And the more I learned, the more fascinated I got. And so I approached the two brothers and asked, could I tell their story? And not only did they say I could, they shared a lot of their personal information, their time, interviews, but also clued me into some of the archival material for their unit and their era.
Well, this is a story that certainly it's far beyond a war story. The human element here that weaves its way through is really pretty extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the thing that struck me. 2 brothers, 2 years apart, grew up together in Nebraska, played sports together, goofed around outside together in the countryside, did all that stuff that people do in small-town America. Had worked their whole lives. Chuck Hagel mentions sometimes, he reminds me, he says, hey, I got my Social Security card when I was 8 years old. I mean, so great work ethic, great family, and volunteered, both men volunteered for the draft and then volunteered a second time for Vietnam because they thought it was the right thing to do.
What as you research this book and you talk to people and you talk to them, what was there anything about the war in Vietnam in that period that you found out are the opinions, observations that you heard that may have changed your opinion of that war?
I'll tell you, not necessarily mine. Since I was in the military, I came in in 1978. So all the sergeants and officers who trained me when I came in were all Vietnam veterans, and they clearly knew what they were doing. They were good men in the infantry of that time, and had learned some tough lessons in the war. But I think the thing that will surprise people when they go back and look at that war, our public views, media, etc., have colored our opinions to a degree. We tend to think of the Vietnam veterans in some cases as guys on drugs, guys fighting with their chain of command, rolling grenades under their bunks, and all this other stuff. That's pretty scurrilous. I mean, there were certainly cases of that, and I don't want to underscore them. And as the war went on, you had more and more of that because nobody likes being in a lost war. But the bravery and the camaraderie and the guts of these guys and the brains they used in this difficult jungle fighting was just incredible to me. As impressive as anything I saw during my service in Iraq or Afghanistan. I mean, these guys could stand toe-to-toe with any of the Marines who fought on Iwo Jima or the soldiers who stormed the beach at Normandy. I mean, they're right up there. I don't think we gave them a good strategy when we stuck them in the middle of a guerrilla war in Southeast Asia, but their fighting ability and their ability to work with each other and to do their job under tough conditions was just amazing. And the Hagel brothers were right in the middle of that.
Well, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and as always, some smart talk radio going on here right now with Daniel Bolger, a prolific author, retired in the military after serving 35 years, retired as a lieutenant general, commanded troops in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and he also is a contributing editor for Army Magazine. The subject at hand is a new work called Our Year of War, Two Brothers, Vietnam, and a Nation Divided. Well, Dan, if you would, give us a little bit more specifically, Chuck and Tom Hagel serving in Vietnam. Tell us what they did together and what drew them close and what might have thrown them apart.
Well, what they did together was probably the toughest task that we can ask ground combat troops to do. They volunteered to serve in the same platoon. You know, the U.S. military cannot force close family members, immediate family, to serve together. Brothers, sisters, mom, dad, husband, wife. They can't do that. It's by law since World War II, since we lost the 5 Sullivan brothers on the USS Juneau off Guadalcanal. Japanese torpedoed that ship, that light cruiser. And as a result, by law, you can't make close family members serve together to avoid losing a whole generation in one bad day. So the Hagel brothers volunteered for it, and what they volunteered to do, when they got to their platoon, they were both very sharp guys. I mean, both guys had been asked, did they want to become officers, and they both turned it down. Not because they didn't want to lead. In fact, they both rose to be sergeants, so they were certainly leading operations. But frankly, because both guys said, well, what will that do to my service obligation? And the Army, of course, told them, oh, we'll make you a second lieutenant. You'll serve an extra few years. They said, thanks, but no thanks. We're doing our job now. And what that job was, when the platoon of 30 guys or so would go out in the jungle through this heavy bush and undergrowth, the 2 guys in front were called the point team. The point man was the guy right in the front, and behind him was what was called the slack man, walking just back. They would navigate the platoon. They were the ones who directed where it was moving. And, of course, no GPS, no smartphone back then, nothing like that. You had to use a compass. You had to use pace count. You had to look at the ground and the map and try and figure out where you were and work it out and navigate. And the front guy, the brothers would swap off. The front guy would often be chopping with a machete, but he couldn't just whack away because he had to look for mines buried in the ground. He had to look for tripwires that could pull a booby trap, and he had to watch for evidence of the Viet Cong who were trying to ambush him. So it was a very difficult job, and of course the Hagel brothers had real challenges doing it. The brothers were wounded 5 times between them, so 5 Purple Hearts. Tom wounded 3 times, Chuck wounded twice, and it's just a reminder of how dangerous that job is. The real miracle, they were doing everything right, yes, but they were very, very fortunate that they made it out of there.
Dan, the Hagels did come from a long line of military family, did they not?
Yes, they did, and that's a really good that's a really good point, Warner, because their great-grandfather had actually driven wagons for the U.S. Army during the Plains Indian Wars, which some of that occurred in Nebraska. Their grandfather had served in World War I, the Great War. At that time, they thought it was going to be the war to end all wars. It wasn't. Their dad was a B-24 tail gunner fighting in the Pacific in World War II against the Japanese. So they had grown up. I mean, their dad was a big VFW member. They're Veterans of Foreign Wars, American Legion, all that stuff. Their mom was part of the auxiliary at the American Legion. So they'd grown up, as many of that generation did, with fathers and uncles who had all served in World War II and grandfathers who had served in World War I.
I'm curious, does the attitude towards the military, in your opinion, when you come from a family that has been immersed in it, so to speak, for several generations, you would think it would automatically create an affinity for service, but does it necessarily do that all the time?
Well, there's the old comment about familiarity breeds contempt. You can get two reactions. One reaction is, hey, I want to do exactly what my dad and grandfather did, and, nowadays even your mom or grandmother or whatever. But the other reaction is, boy, I'm going to strike out on my own path. I'm going to be my own person. I'm not going to do that. In the Hagel's case, they respected their father and grandfather greatly, and they even knew their great-grandfather, and they did want to follow in that footstep. Now, I think it would be fair to say that neither of them, and they weren't alone in this, a lot of Americans would agree, neither of them really understood that Vietnam was going to be a lot different than either of the world wars. I mean, this was going to be a war against an enemy who often didn't wear a uniform, no front lines, guerrilla combat with mines and booby traps and ambushes rather than sort of a fight against people with tanks and wearing uniforms. But, as young guys, they didn't really know all that. But it's interesting, the more that time they spent in Vietnam, although Tom continued to do his job well, Chuck sort of stuck with the idea that the war was worth fighting. Tom came to the impression, hey, this war is screwed up. The South Vietnamese aren't really doing their part. They seem very corrupt. And he began to believe that his own government, the U.S. government, had sold a lot of falsehoods to the American people, setting us up for this war. But nevertheless, Tom still served because obviously, it was his life on the line, and it was the other soldiers, one of whom was his own brother.
Right. Well, and part of the subtitles on the front talk about, in the jungles of Vietnam, each brother was destined to save the other's life. Take us deep into that. Share with us what that's all about.
Well, this was something that when I dug into it, the Hagel brothers are very decent, modest guys. They don't like to talk about themselves. So I found out about a lot of this from looking at records, where they'd say what happened on particular operations, looking at citations for valor awards and things. So in March 1968, a few months after the Tet Offensive, enemy Viet Cong still very active around Saigon. That's where Chuck and Tom's unit was stationed. They're chopping their way through the jungle. Tom and Chuck out front as usual. Chuck's out front this day, and they tripped a very large booby trap. One that was hanging up in the trees, these different explosives, and they showered the unit with what would look to you or I like buckshot, but very hot and high rate of speed coming out of these explosives. Blew Chuck over, blew Tom over, killed one guy outright that was next to him, and knocked down a bunch of other guys wounded. Tom dragged Chuck out of the line of fire because, of course, the Viet Cong immediately opened up with AK-47s and machine guns and all this. He dragged his brother out of the line of fire. Both of them were bleeding. Chuck was out cold. Tom was not in the greatest shape. Managed to give him some first aid to stop the bleeding, and Chuck, was going to make it. But if Tom hadn't been there, it's hard to say what would have happened because the other guys next to him were all out of it, and the enemy had opened fire. So basically, Tom saved Chuck that day, although both were wounded. Both got a Purple Heart. Okay, fast forward 5 weeks. It's April now. Now they're on an operation in a village. In this case, the vehicle they were on, which is an armored vehicle, hits a big mine in the road. The side of it blows up, starts on fire, all this kind of stuff. Chuck's blown off the vehicle. Tom's knocked out up on top of the vehicle. And if he stays there another 30 seconds, this thing's going to burn up and set off all the ammunition inside and blow up like a giant mushroom cloud. So Chuck crawls under the burning vehicle, grabs his brother, drags him off, And, again, both guys wounded that day, both got Purple Hearts, but if Chuck hadn't been there, Tom would not have come back.
Wow, I'm just imagining. Sometimes brothers bond playing pickup basketball out in the driveway. Tell me about, as a result of this, what happens? Can you take us through the next, I guess, will be subsequent weeks or days or months in terms of recovery, and just how did they look at one another after that?
Well, the thing was, given their age, they're young guys. One of the reasons the military likes young people, of course, is because of their strength and resilience. Although they had been wounded in both cases, they just wanted to get back to their unit and finish their time. And although they had been wounded, it was not debilitating wounds. They did not lose a limb or eye or anything like that. So after in both cases a couple days recovery, they were sent back to their units. When they were burned, that one was a little tougher. Chuck was on light duty for a couple weeks because part of the one side of his body was so badly burned he had to put bandages on, and of course it's 90-degree heat, 90% humidity in that jungle, so it was really a burden out there, and you got to worry about infection and malaria and God knows what else. So, but they continued to fight. They fought through the remainder of their tour, doing their job. Tom, in fact, was wounded a third time on a helicopter assault in July. So they really did their part. And you talk about bonding. The two brothers, Chuck knew that Tom had really soured on the war. Tom knew that Chuck really kind of still believed in the mission of the war to fight the communists in Vietnam. And as smart brothers do, they realize, hey, don't push those buttons while we're over here. The other troops got to depend on us. We're sergeants by now. We got to depend on each other. And so they didn't. Now, when they got home, it was a different story. But they had time then to reflect.
You can't talk about Vietnam without thinking about President Johnson, President Nixon, Curtis LeMay, who ultimately ran for the vice presidency with George Wallace, and William Westmoreland. Interested, Dan, in your perspective on those people as leaders in the time, good, bad, and indifferent.
Sure, and I do mention this, both Hagel brothers. The one thing you remember, war then had a lot of similarities to now. They knew the news in the United States. They were getting it pretty much real time. Satellites were already up. People back home could see their brothers and sons and stuff on TV fighting, and they could find out what was going back home. So both brothers were aware, for example, of the King assassination in April when Dr. Martin Luther King was killed on April 4th of 1968. Both knew about Bobby Kennedy, Senator Bobby Kennedy, being killed during the presidential campaign out in California in June of 1968. And they knew about the rioting in American cities and on college campuses. So all those things were stuff that was very much present to them in their life, and they knew about that. The other thing that I should mention for both brothers that they were dealing with during the time they were over there is they had all the other soldiers that were dependent on them. So they couldn't just sort of get in the back of the line and just let things go. They had to take a leading role because they were sergeants. They were the guys out front, and they worked their way through that for that very, very difficult year. When I look at it, I'm just amazed. Now, leaders you talk about. So we got President Johnson and President Nixon, the two presidents that were in office at that time. Now, it won't surprise you, Chuck Hagel, he was a Nixon man. Neither of them were Johnson men. They both thought that Johnson had screwed up, but although Tom was more on the liberal side and preferred the liberal candidates, he was no fan of Johnson. William Westmoreland was the first general in the war, and of course, he was replaced in 1968 by General Creighton Abrams. But William Westmoreland, although a good commander in World War II, he really didn't understand what was going on in Vietnam. And I think he thought the war could be won by just killing Viet Cong, and he didn't realize, hey, these guys are not going to quit just because you kill a lot of them. And they hide really, really well because they're going to stay out of the way, hoping the Americans will tire out. The Viet Cong correctly realized, and the North Vietnamese who were running the show from Hanoi, the number that counted wasn't the number of dead Viet Cong. It was the number of dead Americans. And they knew that if they could kill enough Americans, we would lose faith in a long, grinding war. And that Tet Offensive came as such a shock to Westmoreland and Johnson and all the Americans. Nixon came in with his plan to end the war. I think a lot of people, including Chuck Hagel, thought it was going to be executed quickly. It wasn't. It took until 73 to get most of the U.S. troops out, and Nixon was out of office, had resigned by the time the war ended with a North Vietnamese victory. Yeah. Now, Curtis LeMay is another guy you mentioned. He was in a very awkward position as a vice presidential candidate to George Wallace in 68. But LeMay was a great combat commander in World War II. Probably should have stayed out of politics. Tremendous Air Force general, built the modern strategic, nuclear force that defends us to this day. But a guy who should have definitely stayed out of politics. And I think, by the way, that's good advice for most generals and admirals.
So I've got a question for you. And again, but before I ask you the question, I will tell our audience, if you do not know, of course you know this, you're listening to Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, is always from the flight deck, and a really good conversation here with Daniel Bolger, a prolific author, but more importantly, retired lieutenant general in the Army, served there for 35 years, and also writes for Army Magazine and teaches history at NC State in Raleigh, North Carolina. A brand new work, a fascinating one called Our Year of War. All right, I'm going to put you here on the spot just a little bit, but your military background, you've got the benefit now of a rear view mirror. If I dialed back to let's just go 1965, you've got the magic wand. Tell me what you would have done in Vietnam. Do we go in and we, quote, try to win it, or do we get out of it?
Get out.
Okay.
It's a peripheral area. I mean, the Vietnamese people are wonderful people, but there were a lot of places in the world where there was trouble. It was a secondary area. We definitely should not have poured. I mean, we put 500,000 troops in there, Warner. Yeah. I mean, we were most of our Air Force, most of our Navy off the coast. I mean, the Russians and Chinese enjoyed it because it gave them a free run for the next 15 years. And
right.
Were it not for some changes near the end of the Cold War, they could have come out a lot further ahead. But, a real blunder and sad.
So we just basically simply just stalled the ultimate sort of takeover, so to speak, of South Vietnam. That's all it did.
Yeah, and that's what's really unfortunate. There's an odd quirk, though. Today we actually have very good relations with the communist government of Vietnam, right. And we have trade relations with them. Our military actually does exercise with them. Our ships dock at Cam Ranh Bay again, which we had built in the early 1960s. So it's kind of amazing.
Well, Dan, as we start to wind down here, reflect a little bit, go up to 100,000 feet. We ask guests this from time to time. What's the takeaway here? What's the big headline, in your opinion, of the research you did, the conversations you had, in the context of Our Year of War?
I think the biggest takeaway to me is that there's a lesson in sending good young men like the Hagel brothers to execute flawed strategies. I mean, no matter how good the soldiers are, and we have great soldiers and sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardmen, and the American military, they can't remedy a flawed policy. And that's something we need to keep in mind. Our founders were pretty smart guys, and they said that if you're going to commit the American military, you should have debate, you should have a recorded vote, you should have a declaration of war. Our country hasn't had a declared war since Pearl Harbor. And, we've served on a lot of fighting. And a lot of those have not turned out in a way that most American people would like. So I think maybe it's time to go back to our roots and start doing stuff the right constitutional way. And that means look before we leap. Don't be so quick to send in the military. Because as you pointed out, in 65, Vietnam looked like something you could handle pretty quickly. It sure had gotten pretty bad 10 years later.
Well, the work is called Our Year of War, Two Brothers, Vietnam and a Nation Divided by Daniel Bolger. A really, really tremendous read here. Dan, before we get out of here, how can people pick up a copy of this book and also check out a lot of some of the other writings that you've done in the past?
Well, if they go on DaCapo Press, DACAPO Press.com, they can look at all about Our Year of War. They got quite a bit of information there. And Amazon has all my other writings, to include the latest one, Our Year of War. So those are two good places that people can go to check it out.
Well, listen, thank you so much for your service, and appreciate the written contributions as well. And I'd love to have you on again sometime.
No, it'll be my pleasure, and thank you very much. My honor to serve and my honor to talk to you today.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this.